Bronx Hollow. It was a place that most people learned to avoid as soon as the sun began to set. The kind of neighborhood that sent shivers down your spine, even when you were miles away from it. Streets twisted and turned in unexpected ways, lined with old, crumbling buildings that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. The kind of place where even the bravest souls, after hearing the stories, chose to stay far, far away when the darkness crept in. There was something about the air, something that felt wrong. People whispered about it, but only in hushed tones, as if saying too much would bring it to life. Something sinister lived in the corners of Bronx Hollow, something older than anyone cared to understand. And the locals, they knew better than to tempt fate. But Jake wasn't like the locals. Jake was different. He was an outsider, a curious soul who had no patience for stories that were nothing more than superstitions. To him, Bronx Hollow was just another part of the city, a place he needed to be for a fresh start. A small, cheap apartment in the heart of the neighborhood, nestled between two run-down buildings, was perfect for him. He had no intention of staying long, just long enough to get his feet on the ground. The rent was affordable, and he didn't mind the neighborhood's reputation. He had heard the stories, of course. He'd heard about the strange happenings, the ghostly tales, the rumors about the curse that haunted the streets after dark. But Jake wasn't the kind of person to get swept up in ghost stories. He didn't believe in curses, and he definitely didn't believe in spirits. It wasn't until his first night in Bronx Hollow that everything changed. Jake had spent the day unpacking his things, setting up his modest apartment. The room was small, but it was his. The floor creaked underfoot, and the walls were thin, but it was the perfect place for someone like him, someone who didn't need much. As the sun began to set, he decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. He wanted to familiarize himself with the area, find a corner store or a coffee shop. Something that would make him feel less like an outsider. The moment he stepped outside, the atmosphere was different. The streets felt darker, even though the sun had only just dipped below the horizon. The air had a heaviness to it, the stillness that Jake couldn't explain. There wasn't much traffic, and the few people he passed on the sidewalk hurried by with their heads down, their eyes avoiding his. Jake tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just a rough neighborhood, and that people here probably kept to themselves. He turned a corner and found himself walking down a narrow street. The houses here were even older, their windows broken and boarded up. A distant rumble of thunder in the sky made him look up, but the clouds were dark, moving unnaturally fast, like they were being pushed by something more powerful than the wind. Suddenly, Jake heard something that made him pause. It was a soft sound, barely audible. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then he heard it again, a faint whisper. It seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. The words were unclear, lost in the noise of the wind, but one thing was unmistakable. The voice. It was calling his name. Jake. Jake. Jake stopped in his tracks. He felt a chill run through his spine, his breath catching in his throat. He looked around, but there was no one. The street was empty, the windows of the buildings dark and lifeless. The only sound was the wind, howling faintly through the narrow alleyways. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it. It was just his imagination. The city had a way of playing tricks on people's minds. He took a step forward, but the whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Jake, Jake." This time, he froze. His heart skipped a beat, and his palms grew clammy. The voice, it was too real. It wasn't just in his head. He turned slowly, looking down the street. But there was no one. The only movement was the flickering of a streetlight far in the distance. The voice came again, this time softer, as if it were right behind him. "Jake." His body tensed, and he spun around quickly. But the street was still empty. His breathing quickened, and his stomach tightened with fear. He felt like he was being watched, like something was just out of sight, waiting for him to turn around. For a moment, he stood frozen, his eyes darting around. Then, in a burst of panic, he ran. His footsteps echoed loudly as he sprinted down the street, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to get away from the voice, away from whatever was following him. He turned a corner, desperate for the safety of his apartment. He didn't care about the stories, the rumors, or the curse. He just needed to be inside, away from the whispers. As he reached the door of his apartment building, he shoved it open and hurried inside. He slammed the door shut behind him, locking it quickly. The building was quiet, as if nothing had happened. The voice was gone. It was just his imagination, he told himself. It had to be. There was no way the stories were true. No way. But as he stood there, catching his breath, he heard something else. A faint creak from above. Jake glanced up toward the second floor, the floor where he had rented his apartment. His heart skipped a beat as he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above him. He stared at the ceiling, frozen in place. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. There was no one. The morning after the unsettling experience, Jake was struggling to shake off the strange feeling that had consumed him the night before. His apartment felt colder than usual, and the noises, those whispers, seemed to linger in his mind like a haunting melody he couldn't escape. He couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to the stories people had told him. But no. He refused to let fear control him. It was just a trick of his imagination, he reasoned. He couldn't let a few creepy noises dictate his life. Still, the tension in the air, the strange way the shadows clung to the walls, and the silence of the building had a way of creeping into his thoughts. He was new to this place, and maybe it was just the unfamiliarity that made him anxious. He decided that he would push through it. After all, it was just a place, right? As Jake stepped out of his apartment to head down the hallway, he saw Mrs. Gonzalez again. The old woman had lived in the building longer than anyone could remember, her presence a fixture in the neighborhood. Her thin frame and bent posture were the least intimidating parts about her. But there was something in her eyes, something that spoke of years of experience, of having seen things no one else had. And something about the way she stared at him made Jake uneasy. She was standing near her door, a weathered hand resting on the knob, her tired face drawn in concern as she watched him approach. The moment he passed, she spoke. "You look nervous, boy," she said, her voice raspy, as if she hadn't spoken in days. "Did you hear them? The whispers?" Jake's heart skipped a beat. He nodded, though he wasn't sure why. He wasn't about to admit that the sounds from last night had freaked him out. But something in Mrs. Gonzalez's eyes made him want to hear what she had to say. She motioned for him to come closer, her frail hand gesturing toward the dimly lit hallway behind her. "Come inside," she murmured. "We need to talk." Reluctantly, Jake stepped into her apartment. The air was heavy with the smell of old furniture and dust. The room was small and dimly lit, the curtains drawn tightly shut. The only light came from a single lamp on the coffee table, its glow casting long, stretched shadows on the walls. Mrs. Gonzalez slowly made her way to an old armchair and gestured for him to sit across from her. "I've seen that look before," she said with a sigh, her eyes heavy with something beyond concern. "You think it's just a story, don't you? A little ghost story to scare the newcomers." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of how to respond. He didn't want to dismiss her, but he wasn't about to buy into some old lady's fairy tale. Still, he felt a strange sense of unease settle in his chest. She leaned forward, her frail fingers trembling as she clasped them together in her lap. Her voice grew lower, almost as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "But let me tell you something, young man. The Hollow, it's been cursed for generations. The spirits here are old, and they're hungry." Jake blinked, startled. "What do you mean, cursed?" Mrs. Gonzalez's face tightened with fear, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw something like sorrow in her eyes. "This place, this neighborhood, it's been haunted for years. People come and people go, but they never leave. Not really. The spirit of Bronx Hollow, it takes them. One way or another." Jake scoffed at first, trying to shake off the uneasiness that gnawed at his stomach. "Come on, Mrs. Gonzalez. It's just an old myth. A bunch of superstition. People love making up stories about places like this. They just want to feel important or something." But the old woman didn't flinch. Instead, she fixed her eyes on him with such intensity that it made Jake uncomfortable. Her voice shook as she spoke, but the words she said carried weight. "No, boy, you don't understand. This isn't just a story. It's real." She paused, as if contemplating how to continue. "I've laid here my whole life, and I've seen things, terrible things. People who move in thinking they can handle it, thinking they're stronger than the stories. But the spirit, it sees them, it knows them, and it always claims what it's due." Jake tried to laugh it off, but the unease he'd been feeling ever since he moved into this building, deepened. So you're telling me this place is cursed, and there's a spirit that takes people? Mrs. Gonzalez's eyes grew wide, the fear in them unmistakable. If you're still here by midnight tomorrow, the spirit will claim you. Mark my words, boy. ... Jake froze, his mind racing. Was she serious? What was she talking about? He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was barely noon. A full night ahead. He laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. Come on, I don't believe in that stuff. I'm sure it's just, old legends, nothing more. But Mrs. Gonzalez wasn't laughing. Her face was pale, her eyes locked on his as she leaned closer. You think it's funny now, but you'll see. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, or how strong you think you are. The Hollow claims those who are meant to stay. The whispers you heard last night, they were just the beginning. Jake's throat tightened, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He tried to dismiss the thoughts that were creeping into his mind, the ideas that made his skin crawl. But something about Mrs. Gonzalez's words made him question everything. The voice he had heard, the strange feeling that followed him in the building. Was there some truth to what she was saying? Could he really be in danger? I'll be fine, he said, though it didn't sound convincing even to himself. I'll just stick around, stay in my apartment, and mind my business. I'm sure everything's just fine. But Mrs. Gonzalez wasn't finished. Her voice dropped to a whisper, and she leaned closer, as if revealing a secret she shouldn't be sharing. The curse is older than you can imagine. It's been around long before this place was even built. People die here, and they don't leave. Not truly. Their souls are trapped, and when the time comes, the spirit will claim you. And there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. Jake felt a chill wash over him, and though he wanted to dismiss her, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was telling him something he wasn't ready to hear. Something that rang too true. I'll be gone long before that happens, he said with a forced smile, standing up to leave. Thanks for the talk, Mrs. Gonzalez. The old woman nodded, her eyes still wide with concern. I hope for your sake you're right, she whispered, but I don't think you'll be able to leave, not once the Hollow has marked you. Jake left her apartment with a nervous laugh, but deep inside, he felt the cold creeping back into his bones. Mrs. Gonzalez wasn't the first person to mention the curse, but her words carried a weight that none of the others had. The whispers, the strange occurrences, were they all connected? As Jake stepped back into the hallway, he couldn't help but feel the weight of her warning settling on him. He was new to this place, and maybe he didn't understand it yet, but something told him that if he stayed in Bronx Hollow for too long, he might never get the chance to leave. The clock was ticking. Jake had tried to shake off the unease that had been gnawing at him ever since his conversation with Mrs. Gonzalez, but the feeling stuck to him like a shadow. And no matter how much he tried to convince himself it was all just his imagination, his nerves wouldn't calm down. The strange sounds, the cold spots in the apartment, the whispers that seemed to echo in his mind, he couldn't get rid of them. His thoughts raced in circles, each one leading to the same conclusion. There was something wrong with this place. He didn't know what it was, but it was becoming harder and harder to deny. Late that night, when the silence in the apartment felt too suffocating, Jake finally gave in to the need to leave. He couldn't sleep, not with the thoughts spinning endlessly in his head. He grabbed his jacket and decided to take a walk, hoping that the cold air and the quiet of the night would clear his mind. He wasn't sure where he was going, just that he needed to get out of the apartment. Maybe some fresh air would do him good. The streets of Bronx Hollow were eerily quiet. The usual hum of the city had long disappeared, leaving behind an unsettling stillness that made Jake feel like he was the only one alive. The houses on either side of the street seemed like hollow shells, dark and foreboding. The streetlights flickered sporadically, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. With each step, the feeling that something was watching him grew stronger. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his breath came out in short, shallow gasps. He couldn't explain it, but the longer he walked, the more he felt like he was being drawn into something he couldn't escape. As he walked further into the neighborhood, he passed by an old, rundown house at the end of the block. It looked abandoned, just like the others, but there was something different about it. The windows were boarded up with old, rotting wood, and the front door was barely hanging on its hinges. But what caught Jake's attention was the faint, flickering light coming from inside. It was soft at first, like the glow of a candle. But as he got closer, he saw that the light was coming from a single dimly lit room. Without thinking, Jake found himself drawn to the window. He stopped, his heart racing in his chest as he peered through the cracked glass. The room inside was small, dim, and dusty, with the kind of oppressive atmosphere that made his stomach churn. The air felt heavy, like it was thick with something dark and ancient. What caught his eye, though, was the altar. It was at the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of flickering candles. The wax dripped down the sides of the candle holders, pooling on the floor in strange glistening puddles. The altar itself was covered in dark cloth, and on it lay various objects that Jake couldn't quite make out from his vantage point. Something about the scene felt wrong, too ritualistic, too deliberate, as if the room had been prepared for something. But it wasn't just the altar that drew his attention. It was the woman sitting in the middle of it all. At first, Jake thought she might be a figment of his imagination. She was so still, so unnatural in her stillness, that it almost didn't seem possible she could be real. She had long, black hair that cascaded around her pale face, her skin as white as the moonlight that barely pierced through the grime on the window. Her features were sharp, almost angular, as if she were carved from marble. But it was her eyes that held Jake's gaze. They were dark, empty pits, yet they seemed to glow with an unnatural light. When Jake looked into them, it was as if they could see right through him, into the very depths of his soul. His breath hitched in his throat. He couldn't look away. For a moment, there was no sound, no movement, just the flickering light of the candles and the woman's unblinking gaze. But then, as if sensing his presence, her head slowly turned toward the window, her eyes locking onto his with a terrifying intensity. Jake's blood ran cold. He stumbled backward, his heart racing, his chest tightening with panic. His legs felt like they were made of lead as he tried to step away, but his feet wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, his entire body shaking uncontrollably. And then she spoke. "You should have never come here." Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Jake's knees buckle. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The words sank deep into his mind, sending a wave of terror crashing through him. He didn't know what was worse, the fact that she had spoken to him, or the fact that it felt like she had been waiting for him. Jake's panic surged, his legs finally obeying as he spun around and ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away from that house, away from those eyes. His heart pounded in his chest as he bolted down the street, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the walls, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was still watching him, that she was still out there, waiting for him to turn back. As he reached the end of the block, he risked a glance over his shoulder. The house loomed behind him, its windows dark and silent. But the light from inside had disappeared. The flickering candlelight was gone, leaving nothing but an empty, lifeless shell. For a moment, Jake wondered if he had imagined the whole thing. If the woman, the altar, everything had just been a trick of his mind, brought on by the stress of being in a new place. But then, the door slammed shut. Jake froze in his tracks. The sound was loud and jarring, like the final, deafening punctuation to a sentence he hadn't wanted to hear. He turned slowly, staring at the house. The door was still there, hanging by a single hinge, the wind howling through the broken window. But now, there was no sign of movement, no flicker of light, just an overwhelming silence. Jake's chest tightened as he stood there in the street, his heart racing, his hands trembling. He had to get away. He had to get back to his apartment and lock the door. He had to forget what he'd seen, forget the woman with the dark eyes who had stared into his soul. But as he turned to leave, a voice whispered in the back of his mind, the same voice he had heard before. "You'll never leave." The words were a cold, unsettling truth that sank. Jake didn't look back again as he hurried back to his apartment. He couldn't. But as he locked the door behind him, the image of that woman, sitting silently in the flickering candlelight, haunted him. And deep down, he knew that whatever was happening in Bronx Hollow, it was far from over. The days after Jake's eerie encounter with the woman from the old house became a blur of sleepless nights and growing unease. Each passing hour seemed to drag on. And And the once familiar apartment he had hoped would bring him comfort now felt more like a prison. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they only grew louder, more insistent. It started with a faint rustling sound, like wind passing through an empty hall, but soon they became unmistakable voices, echoing through the stillness of his apartment. At first, Jake tried to ignore them. He convinced himself it was just stress. Maybe the loneliness of moving into a new city was messing with his head. But as the days wore on, the whispers became harder to dismiss. It was as though they were following him everywhere he went, always just out of sight, always too quiet to fully hear, but clear enough to send a chill down his spine. Objects began to move when he wasn't looking. The kitchen light would flicker on and off at random times, and the chairs at the dining table would shift, as if someone had just gotten up and walked away. At night, the door to his apartment creaked open without explanation, even though he was sure he had locked it. And the worst part, those cold gusts of wind. The apartment's windows were tightly shut, yet every evening, the temperature would drop suddenly. A chilling breeze sweeping through the rooms, freezing his skin. It felt as though the wind itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. But it was the whispers that haunted him the most. They started as faint murmurs, a name called in the dark, a rustle in the corners of the room. It was as if someone was standing behind him, their breath on his neck, whispering words he couldn't quite make out. But then, the voice grew bolder, louder, clearer. "Leave or die." The voice was unmistakable. "Jake, you can't escape." The words echoed in his ears, reverberating through his skull, pressing down on him like a heavy weight. It wasn't just the voice anymore. It felt like something was inside him, tugging at his thoughts, trying to pull him towards something terrible. He couldn't focus, couldn't sleep, couldn't even eat without feeling like something unseen was looming over him. Each time he turned a corner or looked over his shoulder, he expected to see the woman's dark eyes watching him from the shadows. Jake knew something was wrong, something deep and dangerous. But he didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to accept the truth that Mrs. Gonzalez had warned him about. Yet the more strange occurrences piled up, the harder it was to deny the reality of the curse. He had to get out of Bronx Hollow. He had to leave before whatever was haunting him took hold for good. He couldn't stay in that apartment, not with the strange forces that seemed to move around him. So he packed his bags late one night, determined to escape. He didn't care where he went. He just needed to get away from this place, this suffocating curse. He thought about just leaving everything behind. His things, the apartment, the strange whispers. But nothing felt like it would ever be enough. He had to get away from Bronx Hollow, from whatever dark forces were watching him. He grabbed his keys, shoved them into his pocket, and left the apartment without looking back. His heart was pounding in his chest, his breath coming in short, anxious bursts. He walked quickly, trying to ignore the feeling that the air itself was thick with unseen eyes, watching his every move. When he reached the parking lot, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his hands trembled as he reached for his car keys. It was almost as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The streets were empty, the silence oppressive, and the only sound was the echo of his footsteps as he walked to his car. Jake got into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind him. He started the engine, feeling a flicker of hope. Finally, he was leaving. The engine roared to life, and for the first time in days, he felt a small measure of relief. He put the car in drive and began to pull out of the parking lot, the headlights cutting through the dark streets of Bronx Hollow. But just as he neared the exit, the car lurched, sputtering and jerking. He tried to push the gas pedal down harder, but the car didn't respond. It stalled. The engine sputtered and died. Jake's heart sank. He turned the key again, hoping the engine would start, but it was no use. Panic started to set in. He checked the dashboard. No lights, no power. His phone was on the passenger seat, but when he reached for it, there was no signal. The words from the whispering voice echoed in his head again. Leave or die. Jake grabbed the steering wheel, his hands shaking. What was happening? The city was supposed to have a signal. He had been able to call a cab just days ago. He tried restarting the engine again, but nothing happened. The car was completely dead. His eyes darted around the parking lot. The streets still empty. The neighborhood silent. The darkness pressed in on him from all sides. And then, as if the shadows themselves had come alive, he saw her. The woman from the house, the same one with the pale face and dark eyes, was standing in the middle of the road, her figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlights. Jake's breath caught in his throat as his heart raced uncontrollably. His foot hovered over the brake pedal, but he couldn't move. His body felt frozen, as though the very sight of her was enough to paralyze him. Her long, black hair blew in the wind, and her pale face was illuminated by the dim streetlights. She didn't move, didn't blink, but her eyes, those eyes locked onto his with terrifying certainty. "You're mine now," she said, her voice a chilling whisper carried on the wind. Her smile was slow, malicious, stretching across her face like a predator savoring its next move. "You should have left." Jake's body went cold, his stomach lurching as his mind screamed for him to do something, anything. He couldn't stay here, but his car wouldn't start. He was trapped, alone, in the middle of this cursed place. He reached for the door, ready to get out and run, but before he could even move, the woman raised her hand, and the temperature inside the car dropped dramatically. He could see his breath fogging up the windows, but the air wasn't cold. It was frigid. It was unnatural. Something was in the air, a presence, something that didn't belong in this world. Her grin widened as she took a step closer, her gaze never leaving him. "You can't escape, Jake," she whispered again, her voice sending a chill through his bones. "The Hollow owns you now." And in that moment, Jake realized she was right. There was no escaping Bronx Hollow. No matter how far he ran, no matter how fast he drove, he was bound to this place. The spirit had claimed him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The car stayed still, the engine silent. The road ahead was empty, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it was all a trap he could never leave. The whispers, the strange forces, the woman who haunted his every move, they were all part of the curse. And now it was too late to escape. He had walked into a nightmare, and he would never wake up. Jake stumbled through the hallways of his apartment building, his mind a swirling mess of confusion, fear, and disbelief. His heart pounded in his chest as his eyes darted back and forth, his mind replaying the image of the woman standing in the middle of the road, her eyes locked on his with a predatory gleam. He didn't know what had happened, what he had seen, but he felt the weight of something terrible pressing in on him. He had run, but he didn't know where to go. There was no escape. The curse of Bronx Hollow was real. It wasn't a myth, a story, or some local legend. It was a living, breathing nightmare that he had stepped into without even realizing it. The night he had fled, he had locked himself in his apartment, barricading the door with whatever furniture he could find. He couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building seemed like footsteps. Every gust of wind felt like a breath on his neck. He lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. The whispers, the cold air, the woman, it all felt too real, too close. The force that had followed him from the moment he moved into the building had finally revealed itself, and he had no idea how to stop it. He couldn't stay there, not with the sense of dread that clung to the walls, the constant feeling that he was being watched. The world outside felt just as oppressive, as though the air was thick with something that didn't belong. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He had to get out of Bronx Hollow. He had to leave before it was too late. The next morning, he knew exactly what he had to do. He needed answers. He needed to know the truth about what was happening, about the curse that had claimed this place, and about the woman who seemed to be at the center of it all. There was only one person who might have the answers he was looking for, and that was Mrs. Gonzalez. The old woman lived just down the hall, and although Jake was terrified, he knew he had no other choice. He couldn't keep running, not without understanding what he was up against. He had to confront it. He had to know the truth. He needed to hear it from her, the only person in the building who seemed to know more than anyone else. Jake's hands shook as he knocked on Mrs. Gonzalez's door. There was no answer at first, but after a moment, the door creaked open slowly. Mrs. Gonzalez's tired face appeared in the doorway, and as soon as she saw Jake standing there, her expression softened, but there was no surprise in her eyes. She had been expecting him. "You've come," she said simply, stepping aside to let him in. Jake hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside, his heart still racing, his mind spinning. He had no idea what to expect. He didn't even know if he was ready to hear what she had to say. I don't know what's happening, Jake muttered, his voice trembling. Last night I saw her again. The woman from the house. She's real. She said I couldn't leave. I tried. I tried to get away, but my car died. My phone doesn't work. I can't escape. Mrs. Gonzalez nodded solemnly, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She motioned for Jake to sit, and he did so without hesitation, his mind racing with questions. I told you, boy, she said softly, her voice low and tired. It's the curse of the Hollow. It's not just a ghost. It's something more. Something ancient. Something powerful. The woman you saw, she's the one who started it all. Many years ago, she made a pact to bring darkness to this place. And now, anyone who steps foot here, they belong to it. Jake's heart skipped a beat. A pact? What do you mean? Who is she? Why is she doing this? Mrs. Gonzalez's eyes grew distant, and for a moment, it seemed as though she was lost in a memory. Her name was Eleanor. She was young, beautiful, and full of ambition. But she was also selfish, driven by a hunger for power and control. She was never content with the life she had. She wanted more. She wanted to harness the darkness, to make it hers, and she found a way to do it. Jake stared at her, his mind struggling to process the information. What? She made a pact with something? What kind of thing? Mrs. Gonzalez hesitated for a moment, as if the words were difficult to say. Eleanor didn't just want power. She wanted to control death itself. She sought out a force older than time, something that existed long before this place was built. The spirit of the Hollow, or whatever it truly is. It's not just a ghost. It's a force of nature, a being that feeds on the living, a thing that thrives on the fear and suffering of those who are trapped here. And Eleanor, she made a deal with it. She promised its souls, the souls of anyone who lived in this place. In return, she would be granted eternal power. But what she didn't realize was that the spirit doesn't give, it takes. And once it claims someone, they belong to it forever. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The truth was sinking in, the weight of it crushing him. But why me? Why is it coming after me? Mrs. Gonzalez's face darkened. It doesn't care who you are or where you came from. If you're here, you're a part of it now. The curse doesn't discriminate. It will claim you, just as it claimed all the others before you. It's been like this for generations. People come, thinking they can escape, but the Hollow always claims them. The whispers you hear, the cold winds, the strange occurrences, they're all signs that the spirit is growing stronger. It's feeding on your fear, on your confusion, and it won't stop until it has you. Jake's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms as he tried to process everything. So there's nothing I can do? I'm just stuck here? Forever? Mrs. Gonzalez's eyes softened, but there was no comfort in them. There's no easy way out. The spirit feeds on the souls of the living, and once it has claimed you, It doesn't let go. But there is one way to break the curse. One way to free yourself. But it's dangerous. It's never been done before. You would have to confront the spirit, face it head on. You would have to destroy the altar that Eleanor created, the altar that binds the curse to this place. Only then can the spirit be banished. Jake felt a cold shiver run through him. The thought of facing whatever haunted Bronx Hollow was terrifying. But at that moment, he realized he had no choice. If he stayed, the whispers would never stop. The force that had claimed this place, that had claimed him, would continue to haunt him, feed off his fear, and eventually it would take him. There was no escape unless he fought back. But how do I even begin to do that? Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. How do I fight something like that? Mrs. Gonzalez looked at him with a kind of sadness in her eyes. I can't tell you everything. No one truly knows how to defeat it. But you have to understand this. The spirit feeds on the innocent. It thrives on fear and darkness. If you can find the strength to face it, to confront it without fear, maybe, just maybe, you can destroy it. But I warn you, boy, it won't be easy. It won't be quick, and it will try everything to stop you. Jake nodded slowly, a sense of determination building inside him. He didn't have many options left. The curse was closing in, and he had to fight back. It was the only way to survive. I'll do it, Jake said, his voice firm. I'll find a way to destroy the altar, to break the curse. I won't let it take me. Mrs. Gonzalez nodded, a faint smile on her lips. Be careful, Jake. You're not just fighting for your life. You're fighting for your soul. As Jake left her apartment, the weight of her words pressed heavily on his chest. He knew the journey ahead would be nothing short of hellish. But he also knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let the spirit of Bronx Hollow claim him. Not without a fight. The night of the full moon had arrived, and Jake could feel it deep in his bones, the oppressive weight of the air, thick with an unspoken dread. It wasn't just the chill in his apartment that made him shiver. It was something far darker, something intangible, but undeniably present. The whispers, which had plagued him for days, were louder now, more distinct, and their meaning clearer than ever before. Leave, leave, leave. The words seemed to echo from every corner of the room, each one growing more urgent, more insistent. They gnawed at his mind, tugging at his thoughts, and the sound of them was so overwhelming that it felt like his own thoughts were being drowned out. But it was the chill in the air that terrified him the most. The apartment was freezing, colder than he had ever felt it. The walls felt like they were closing in, and his breath hung in the air like smoke, forming misty tendrils that seemed to stretch and twist in the eerie silence. He couldn't stay here. He knew that much. He had to leave, now. The curse of Bronx Hollow had drawn him in, and every warning, every odd occurrence, had led to this moment. He had heard the stories, listened to Mrs. Gonzalez's warnings, and now here he was, chapped, alone, and surrounded by the very evil that had been creeping up on him for weeks. His heart raced as he stumbled toward the door, his hand shaking as he gripped the cold, rusty handle. but it wouldn't budge. He yanked at the door again, pulling with all his strength, but it remained firmly shut. Panic surged in his chest. He could hear the voice in his head, that low, malevolent whisper that had been following him ever since he'd arrived in the hollow. You cannot escape. His breath became ragged as he backed away from the door. His body trembled and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. There was no way out. The building, the streets, everything felt like it was closing in around him. He looked around the room, searching for something, anything that could help him break free from this nightmare. But the shadows on the walls seemed to grow darker, and the very air in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. And then, just as the fear was becoming unbearable, the temperature dropped even further. Jake's eyes widened in terror as he saw it. The figure of the woman. She was standing in the doorway, just outside his reach. Her silhouette was dark, but her eyes, those eyes, glowed with an eerie, unnatural red. Jake stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest as the woman's chilling presence filled the room. There was no escape. The door wouldn't open, and there was nowhere to run. The whispers had led him here, and now the spirit of Bronx Hollow was claiming him, just as Mrs. Gonzalez had warned. It's too late for you. The woman's voice echoed through the room. It was soft, but its coldness pierced through Jake's very soul. You cannot leave. You never could. Jake tried to scream, to plead for mercy, but no sound escaped his lips. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the sight of her. He wanted to run, to fight, to do anything to break free of the hold she had on him, but his limbs wouldn't obey him. It was as if the very air in the room had become thick, suffocating, preventing him from moving or making a sound. The woman took a slow step forward, her eyes glowing brighter with each movement. She was closer now, and Jake could feel the ice-cold air around her, like the touch of death itself. She reached out a hand, her fingers long and pale, and as she did, Jake felt the temperature in the room drop even further. It was as if the very essence of life was being drained from the space around him. Before he could react, her hand was on him. It was like a freezing vice, cold and unyielding, wrapping around his neck. He gasped for breath, but the air was thick, and no matter how hard he tried to inhale, there was nothing. His vision blurred, and the room spun as the pressure around his neck grew tighter. He collapsed to the floor, his body weak, unable to fight against the force that had him in its grip. The last thing he saw before his eyes closed was the woman's face, her smile twisted and cruel as her red eyes bored into him, her voice whispering in his ear, "You belong to Bronx Hollow now, Jake, forever." And then everything went black. The next morning, the apartment was empty. Jake was gone. His belongings were still in the room, his clothes neatly folded, and his things left where they had been the night before. But Jake himself was nowhere to be found. A door to his apartment was locked from the inside, and there was no sign of a struggle. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but the faintest traces of cold air and the lingering feeling of something dark and unnatural. The whispers returned, just as they had before. Only this time, they were different. They weren't just haunting echoes. They were waiting for the next innocent soul to wander into the hollow. They were patient. They were hungry. And they would never stop. The spirit of Bronx Hollow had claimed another victim. The curse had not been broken. It would never be broken. For those who wandered too far into the hollow, there was no escape. The spirit fed on their fear, their innocence, their very souls, and it would keep feeding until there was no one left to take. And so the whispers continued, the eerie hum of the hollow's curse echoing through the streets, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to step into its grasp. The darkness in the hollow was patient. It would wait, always, until it found its next victim. The haunting of Bronx Hollow continues if you dare.